So as I mentioned earlier, right, the size and the position of elements is automatically calculated by the browser, depending on the content, right, and depending on your siblings, right, where you're going to fall. So this default algorithm of calculating the size and the position can be overwritten, right? In particular, you can override it by using the width, the height, right, and the position attributes, right? And we'll look at them individually. So to illustrate this, we're gonna create two paragraphs, right? There's the yellow paragraph above, and we have the blue paragraphs down below, right? And we'll start playing around with width, height, and position for both of them. So by default, right, paragraph behave like blocks, right? So they take up the entire width of the page. In this case, this is the page, right, on the right-hand side, and also they add vertical spacing in between the content. Yes. All right. So let's start overriding a couple of things here. Notice that here we're overriding the width. So by default, by being a block, my width wants to be the whole width of my container, right? Of the window in this case. But you can override it. It says no. I'm overriding that. It says I don't want you to be the entire width. Instead, I'm only giving you 100 pixels, right? So that's fine, right? The div behaves correctly, right? It's only 100 pixels, but it still has we have not overwritten the height, right? We have overwritten only the width. Yes, the height is still being set by the algorithm, right? The block algorithm is to that your height will always be determined by how much content you have, right? So notice that the height of these two is only 2 lines long, right? But because now we've overwritten the width, notice that the height is now three lines long. See that? All right. So again, that's the block algorithm, right? And also by default, right, the height of the blocks will push everything down, right? It will as it gets smaller, the height will get bigger, right? And we'll keep pushing everything down. That's the block algorithm working for you. Yes. Also notice that even if these widths would be small enough that anything below it could have fit right next to it, yes, right? It's not going to do that, right? Because these are still behaving like blocks, adding the vertical positioning, the vertical spacing, right? Otherwise, it would be inline, so that it would, if it fits, it would be right next to it. Yes, right? Inline would have just gone next to it. It would be move from left to right and from top to bottom. So they're still both behaving like blocks, even if it would have enough space to fit both of them side by side. Make sense? Right? They're still behaving like blocks. All right, let's now override the height. If we override the height, notice that the top one we gave it 80 pixels and the bottom one we gave it 30 pixels. Notice that the top one looks like we gave it more pixels than it needed. Right? Notice that we gave it space maybe for 4 lines. Yes. So notice we have some empty space down below, whereas the bottom one we didn't give it enough even for 2 lines, right? So the content is being clipped, so we're overriding the basic behavior for the height as well here. Now this in particular the bottom one is of interest because, well, what do you do with the content that doesn't fit, right? It looks like the top one, the content fits just nicely. I mean, I have way too much space, right? So there's nothing to do really there. But in the bottom one, we don't have the space. So this kind of like I'm missing some of the data. So there's additional styling that is not shown here that we could override how to treat overflows, right? If the content doesn't fit, what do you want me to do with it? So the default behavior is that it's clipped, right? It just doesn't fit. I'll just clip. It'll be hidden, the content, right? Yes. Right, exactly. Yep, it's clipped and it doesn't affect anything else. Now we could override it and say, no, I want you to show it, right? I want you to spill over and show it. In that case, it still won't push things, but it'll show the content, right? Underneath it, and it'll overlap anything that's below. So you have to be careful, right? Only the width determines on whether I'm going to push things. I'm sorry, the height will determine whether I'm going to push down or not. Okay. So it'll look funny, right? If it overlaps, you see the content just spilling over. But that's one of the options. You can say overflow show, right? by default thing is overflow hidden. Or you can specify that, if it doesn't fit, then give me scroll bars. Give me some scroll bars that will only show, if the size is too small. Right? If it doesn't, well, show me scroll bars. You can say, show me vertical scroll bars or horizontal scroll bars, right? Or both of them, right? And you can specify how they behave. Make sense? Right? Anyway, we haven't looked at overflow. Maybe we'll look at it a little later. But just mentioning some options that might be available when the size doesn't fit. Make sense? All right. All right. How about let's abandon now width and height for a second. Let's take a look at position. All right. Let's go back and just give it the width with 100%. I mean 100 pixels. Let's now look at not the size. Let's look at where they fall, right? Where they're positioned on the screen. So by default, the position is calculated by the browser, again, following the block or inline algorithm. But you can override that. He says, well, one of the easiest way to override it is to use position relative. So position is what allows you to override the behavior of the position, right? And there's a whole bunch of options here, relative, right? The default, I believe, is static, right? Which is, basically scroll with the rest of the content, and the browser is calculating your position. One of the simplest way to override it is to use relative. So relative says to the element, says, hey element, you know where you would normally fall? You know where the browser would normally put you? Well, from there, I want you to move right, left, up, or down. Okay? So you're relative to your normal position, where you would normally fall. Right? And so notice that what I've done here is that by default, it would fall, flush. The yellow and the blue would be flush with one another on the left-hand side. Yes? But here I'm saying that you would normally be flush, but I want you to have 20 pixels on your left, right? So wherever you fall, move right 20 pixels. So left is the equivalent of the X position, right? If you think about it in Cartesian coordinates, yes, it's the equivalent of the X position from the left-hand side. Also, all these left, and we'll see top, left, right, and bottom, right? They're all measured relative to your container. Where is your parent? Based on where your parent is. If your parent is way down there, right, on the bottom right somewhere, then it will be measured from the bottom right, wherever your parent is. Here, we don't have a parent. By default, our parent is just the body, right? And by default, the body of the HTML is the top left, the corner, right? The top left corner is 0, 0. Make sense? So everything is measured from your parent. Yes? Right here, it's measured from the parent and from where you fall off, right? Where you end up being. Make sense? Okay. So yes, we have left. We also can have top. You can say top relative from wherever you fall. Okay, so I can go positive or negative, even though it's considered bad practice to use negative values. Right? We could achieve the same thing by saying bottom 30. Right? It says, meaning I want to move 30 from my bottom. Over here, I want to move from my top. I want to move minus 30 pixels. Right? So meaning wherever I fall, right, top is the equivalent of y, right, of the y-axis, right, measure from the top 0, measuring down. Yes. So margin is my relative position from me and my and other siblings around me, right? This is relative to myself, regardless of anybody else. Meaning I fall where I fall based on my other siblings, but then from there I want to move relative to myself, right? So margins would not let me like overlap you ever, right? Margins will always push me away from you. There's no way from, oh, you mean like margin minus something? Yes, you could accomplish something like this. So it depends what you want to do, right? So here we want to manipulate the position, right? Irrespective to, well, as we'll see in a minute, absolute, or we'll see fixed, right? And we want to move the elements, right? So we would not use margins for that. We would use position. Yeah. Right, so we have the position relative, so top is moving us up and down. Here we have in this case, it's taking a look at, well, what if you apply both left and right or top bottom? What would happen, right? Typically, when you do a Cartesian location, you only provide x and y, yes? But here, because it's a box, right, not only do you have the xy position of one of the corners, you can specify the x position of any one of the corners, right? Well, it makes no sense to specify four xy positions, otherwise it would not be a rectangle, right? It could be some trapezoid or something, right? But you can specify the position of the edges. What do you want to do with the top edge, the bottom edge? What do you want to do with them, right? So here we're specifying both the left and the right, 0, 0, right? So that the behavior here is that that allows you to stretch the edges, right? And grab the left edge, for instance, and move it to the left hand side, all the way to the left hand side, for instance, or the right, move it to all the way to the right hand side, right? And it stretches the entire content, right? This is one of the common questions typically of like when you have like a left hand side, right hand side, like we have the split in our assignment. The left hand side typically only takes up the height of the content, and many folks come back to me and says, well, I would like the whole thing to be stretched, right? To grab the bottom and stretch it all the way to the bottom. But if I do that, the whole content is going to come down, right? So well, then you can grab the top and stretch it to the top, right? And then you can cover an entire height or entire width, right, with whatever elements you might want. Yes, so there's a common example, right, how you could achieve these kinds of things, right? And then you have also other examples of other types of positions. You have the absolute position. We were just looking at relative to where I fall, right? You also have absolute, and an absolute instead measures not from where I would normally fall. It's from where my parent is, right? Wherever my parent is, now that's my 0, 0, all right? And from there, I'm measuring top, left, bottom, and whatnot, yes? Whereas relative is always from where I fall, right? How I want to move relative to me, okay? So absolute, in this case, for instance, we're moving the yellow, 30, 30 pixels, whereas we're moving the bottom one, the blue one, we're moving it 50, 50 pixels. Again, from the 0, 0, right, of in this case, the documents, right, the body. But we could totally put this inside of a div and move the div, right? And then whatever's inside would be relative to that div, right? Yes. Not quite, not yet. We'll see that in a minute. It's using percentages and floats. Okay. Yeah, we'll see that in a minute. Notice what's going on here, right? When you start overriding these positions, right, you have to be careful because you are basically taking you're taking ownership of the layout algorithm, right? You're saying, hey, layout algorithm, I mean, you normally are responsible for laying out things. I am overriding you, right? And you could get into some inadvertent layouts that you were not intended. Like for instance, here we have content that is overlapping other content. Maybe that's what you wanted, maybe not, right? Or maybe it looked fine in a really big screen, but it looks horrible in a small screen, right? So you got to be careful, right? So that especially when you start walking around with these positions and the width and the heights, you have to, especially there, you have to look at it. Do I want it to wrap? Do I not want it to wrap? Do I want it to overlap? Or not overlap? Make sure that it's what you intend. Another thing here that's not particularly covered, but I'd like to just mention it. Notice that it's the blue over the yellow. Why not the yellow over the blue, right? So in this particular case, the answer is that the browser parses the document, okay, and it gets to the yellow paragraph first, and that gets rendered on the screen, right? And then it gets to the second paragraph, and it renders that afterwards, right? And so that's why the blue is on top of the yellow, right? Yes.
So if you're on like Google Drive, for example, and you right click, that brings up a special like right click menu different from what your browser would normally offer.
Yeah.
Is there an API that they can override and style that right click, or are they doing something like this where you're actually like injecting an absolute HTML element.
No, so are you talking about the inspector?
No, I just mean like if you're browsing through your files on
Yeah.
Google Drive, you have a list of your files.
Okay.
Right click on one, you get a bunch of options pop up in
Yeah.
a little box.
On so on Google Drive, when you right click, and yeah, that's an entire div that they're so what they're doing is that they're you can listen to all the clicks on a mouse, and they're popping up their own div with their own and re-rendering that entirely with the DOM elements. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can listen to all the, you can override all the events. There's a couple that you can't override, like if you're on a file system, if you're trying to browse through a file system, you can't override those for security purposes. But most everything else you can override. Yeah. Um, yeah. So notice that it's blue over yellow. But what if you would want to have yellow over blue, right? Irrespective on the document order, right? Well, for that, there's another option which is not shown here. There's another property you can configure, is that notice that now there's a, we're looking at depth, right? We're saying things are on top of each other, right? So not only is there x y position, but now there's a z position, right, on depth. And so you can configure that with another property which is not shown here. It's called the z index, right? And the z index tells you what is the relative depth position of these elements, right? And by default, everybody has the same z index, right? Because normally nothing would overlap over anything else. Your browser typically would not let anything overlap over each other. But when you run into these issues where you deliberately start mucking around and moving things, and things are wrapping or overlapping, then you can configure. It says, "Ooh, I want to show this on top of that." Okay, and the z index allows you to do that. It's higher levels of z index will put things on top of things that have a lower value of z index, right? And I'll come up with an example and add a slide here. Other couple of things, another position type value. Here we have position fixed. So the first one we looked at is relative, position relative. We looked at position absolute, and here's the last one we're going to look at today, is position fixed. So position fixed, like the name suggests, is that it positions an element, right, and its position is relative to the window, right? So now the 0, 0 is the window, not the any parent, not any div, not any container, not the body of the, not even the body of the document, right? It's the window, right? So that means that whenever you position with fixed, that element will not move, even if you scroll right up and down your document. Your element stays fixed, right? This is very useful, for instance, to put sticky headers at the top or sticky footers at the bottom, or maybe social network links somewhere in your page, right? Or maybe navigation elements that allow you to quickly go to the top or quickly go to the bottom, right? That are always fixed in position, and no matter what you do with the scrolling, they always stay in the same place. Make sense? So here's an example of using this H1 and sticking it, at the top of the document, right? So this header H1 is always up the top, right? So even if you start scrolling, right, the heading always stays there. So everything scrolls, but the heading not doesn't scroll. Now you have to be careful, because if you do that, again, you are removing the element from the normal block inline algorithm, right? Where it normally would be pushing everything else, right? Like a heading, what does it do? It adds width, right? And then it adds vertical position. But when you say fixed or absolute and whatnot, what you're doing is that you're removing it from the algorithm. It no longer is considered in the algorithm. So that if normally it would push things down, now it doesn't. Right? So this H1 used to push down all these two paragraphs down, right? But because of putting it in position fixed, it no longer will push these paragraphs down. So what you'll end up having is that, yes, the size and position will be stuck at the top, but these paragraphs will not be pushed down. It will be like under the heading. It will give you like these weird, paragraphs that will be rendered right below the heading, right? So you need to compensate for that. It says, well, what do I do now? Now you have to say, well, somehow I need to, tell these paragraphs to move down a little bit, right? Because it's going to look weird, right? First of all, notice that we made the background white, the background color white, so that even if it's behind, yes, even if it's scrolling behind, you don't see the overlap, Right? You don't see the you don't see the heading through the heading and see the paragraphs behind it. And the second one that we're doing is that by default we need to push these paragraphs down to compensate for the headings not being there anymore, pushing it down. Yes, there's a couple ways we could, we could perhaps just style the first paragraph to to start a little lower. We could do that, or we could take the whole body, right? We could take the whole body, and put a padding at the top, right, to push down all the content down. We could do that as well. There's several ways of doing the same thing. Just to know, right, when you start moving things around like this, right, to be careful with some unintended consequences.